So, um, I've got a few example scenes set up here that we'll work through. This first one is just a basic example. We've got a cube here in the scene and a sphere here in the scene. And then I've got the camera and this thing called the sphere active binding. So if you've ever worked with a web framework, like Angular, or there's other things that aren't web frameworks too that have data binding, one-way data binding or two-way data binding. That's what this is doing. This binding. So you see, a binding takes in a source and a target, and it binds a property of the source to a property of the target. So in this case, we're going to bind whether or not the sphere is active to whether or not the cube is active. Um, so you drag in the source and you drag in the target, and then you set the source member name and the target member name. Um, and so these are what these are. These are the things that you would call as if you were writing code. So uh, game object dot active self is the thing that tells you whether or not the game object's active. You could also use active in hierarchy if you wanted to, but um, so and then here we've got this slash. So most of the times you don't need to use the slash, but the slash is if there's a difference between the getter and the setter. Um, so the thing that comes before the slash is the getter, the thing that comes after the slash is the setter. So the binding will look at the cube and look at its dot active self, and it will see if the sphere's dot active self matches. If it doesn't, it will call the sphere's dot set active to make it match the cube's active self. So if I run it, um, you'll see that if I select the cube and just disable the cube, the sphere gets deactivated as well. So the sphere's active binding is bound to the cube's active binding via this binding right here. So that's our first example. Um, Take a minute and make sure you really understand that before we move on to the next example, because the next example kind of ups in complexity quite a bit. So the next example is template binding. Um, so let me talk about what I've got here in the scene. Right here, I just have a string list. It's just a data class. It's not doing anything fancy. It's just a list of strings. Foo, bar, my, head. And then I've got a canvas set up. And in the canvas, I've got this panel. And the panel has what's called, it's got, first of all, it's got a vertical layout group. Um, and then it's got this template binding. Now, template binding works a little bit different than binding. It doesn't take a target. Instead, it just takes a source. And so it takes a source and a source member name just like before. And then it takes a template. Um, or you can think of the template like a prefab. So what it's going to do is for each item in a list, a template binding is going to instantiate one of these prefabs. So the prefab right here, I've got it under a neutral prefabs node that's going to deactivate itself when the game wakes up. And I've got this button here. And so um, let's run it and see what happens. So if I run it, wait for it to go, you'll see that my original button is now deactivated because it's under the neutral prefabs. And now under the panel, I've got all these clones of the button. One clone for each thing that was in the list. If I change this list to only have 3 things, it changes how many prefabs I have instantiated. And so if I go to 5, I don't know why it didn't work that time, but yeah. So as you change the number of things you have instantiated, um, or as you change the number of things in the list, it automatically changes how many prefabs are instantiated. So that's how the template binding works. Now there's one other thing going on here. So the template binding on the panel is what's instantiating the prefab. But it also does one other thing besides instantiate the prefab. Because you'll notice that when the buttons got instantiated, their text changed. And the template binding didn't do that directly, but it did help. So what it did is, if you look at my button, game object here, you look at the text on the button, the text has a binding on it. And the target of that binding is this text object. Let me get this out of my way because I don't need that right now. So the binding on, the target of the binding is the text object, and we're referencing the text.text. So text.text, this thing right here. That's what we're trying to set with this binding. But you'll notice that the source has not been set. So when a template binding does its thing, when a template binding instantiates a thing, it looks through the hierarchy of the thing it instantiated and looks to see if there's any bindings in that hierarchy, and it sets the source of those bindings to the source that it was originated from, so the source of the list. So what's happening here is you've got foo in the list, so template binding is going to instantiate something for foo, and it's going to look for any bindings in here, and it's going to bind the source of this to foo. So if I run that, that's what's happening is for each, for each one of these, now, if you look at the instantiated one, the text, the original one, still doesn't have a source set. But if you look at the instantiated text, it's telling you that the source right here, this one's null because it has to be a game object for this one to work. But this one, override source, you can see it's bound to foo. Here, in this one, there is no override source, but this one's been bound to foo. This one has been bound to bar, and so on and so on. So if you change the list, I think this will work. If I change it to baseball, then it automatically changes the text there. So template binding is super useful and super powerful. A little weird to wrap your brain around at first, but yeah, hopefully it makes sense. It just instantiates an instance of the prefab and then binds any bindings inside that prefab to the source that it was instantiated for. Alright, so now let's build on that example a little bit. We also have these things called converters. So this scene works exactly the same. Let me just run it so you see what happens. Works exactly the same. The only thing that's happening is we're slightly changing those strings. So before we just had foo bar my head. Now I've got this prefix underscore suffix underscore thing. Foo bar my head. So that, and notice the string list still says foo my head. So where is this prefix and suffix coming from? Well, we have these things called converters that work with bindings. The converters, if I come back to the binding on my prefab, now in this scene I've attached a new thing called convert string appender. And this is a converter. We've got lots of these converters. You can see convert from JSON, or convert is true, convert not, and they're really simple to implement your own converter. All it does is it takes the input, modifies it a little bit, and then passes it back to the binding. So before the binding, so basically you can kind of think of it, the binding takes the source, runs it through the converter, and then whatever the result is, it sets to the target. So this converter is a really simple converter. It just appends a prefix and a suffix to a string if you want. So I can get rid of the suffix, and now when I run it, I'll just have the prefix on the string. So when it runs, I've just got prefix. So the flow is, I've got this value here, template binding. My template binding here instantiates one of my prefabs for every one of those strings. It binds the binding, it binds the source of the binding to that string. The binding then runs that value of the string through the converter before it sets it to the target. So let's take a quick look at another converter. So let's just say, let's get rid of this convert appender string, and let's instead add a convert is truey. Convert is truey. And so we'll run it. And actually, I'm not sure what's going to happen. I think let's just say true or false. And all my computer's being slow on the startup here. There we go. So it just converts them to true, 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 false, false, false. So convert is truey. If I make this an empty string, then now that one's false. And if I make that one an empty string, that one's false. And so it just is doing convert is true. And there's an interesting thing going on here where I'm not sure why that's going on. I think that should still have 4, but for some reason it's grouping the ones that are similar or something weird. But yeah, so that's just another converter. Convert is truey. So it's converting that string foo has a value, so it's true. This string is empty, doesn't have value, so it's false. So that's another converter. All right, so let's go to our last example scene here. Don't save that one. And this one uses something called a bound source chain. So for this example, it's the exact same setup. The only thing I've done is I've scooted that panel over so that the buttons I instantiate will be on the left-hand side of the screen. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, I've put 2 texts. One is just a simple text, nothing special about it, just says selected, nothing's going on. The other text, I've called it dynamic. And the reason I've called it dynamic is because I've put a binding on it, and it's going to be driven by a binding. And you'll notice that it does not have a source set. Its target is the text, text.text, but it doesn't have a source. And so when I hit run, let's see what happens. And again, it's going to take forever to start up. There we go. Okay, so I've got my buttons that I instantiated just like before. But when I press them, you'll see that selected, the value of that dynamic text is changing. You can see the override source is getting set every time I click a button. That override source is getting changed. So that's happening. So we're changing the source of this binding as we go, and that's happening by something called a bound source chain. So if I look at my prefab on this button here, let's move it over to kind of get out of the way. Let's kind of move it down here. If I look at that button, I've added something that wasn't there before. I've added this bound source chain. And what a bound source chain does is it just takes a list of target bindings, and it doesn't do anything with them yet until you tell it to. So this is taking a reference, that dynamic text, and it is holding on to it, and then whenever you call bound source chain.link, it then sets the source of everything in its list to be the source that you tell it to. And so, and there's something else a little bit weird going on here, is that where does it get its source? Well, it gets its source right now. It doesn't have a source, but it gets its source from the template binding. So template binding, when it instantiates the button, it's going to look through the prefab, and it's going to set the source of any bindings or bound source chain. And that's why it's called chain. So this gets its source set by the template binding, and then when you call link, it then passes that source onto everything in its list. So if I make another one, Command D, and I'll call it Dynamic 2, and I'll move it down here. It won't work at first, but if I add Dynamic 2 to my list, then it will. Oh, actually, this is well, that's not true. Let me run this for a second, and then you'll see that they both get set. So each one of these has a bound source chain on it, and each one of them is bound to that. So that's how the bound source chain works. Let's go look at a different way to use bound source chain. So that's using bound source chain with a template binding, where the source of the bound source chain is getting set by the template binding. There's another way you can do it, and I'll go to the game here to show you a reference. Question here and here. You'll see on correct value changed. It changes the bound source chain. It calls bound source chain.link, but it calls a dynamic version of the link. So you have the link right here that takes no parameters, and then you have a different link that takes in a Unity game object. So these are the two links. So you've got this link right here, that's the main link. This one assumes that a source has already been set. This link right here takes in a new source, and it has to be a UniEngine.object. So it sets the source and then it links. So when the value of the question changes in here, it takes the encounter base, sets that encounter base that's the correct value as the source, and then here's the bound source chain link. This bound source chain then passes that source onto these 4 dynamic audios that get played, so that these audios have their audio driven by the encounter base. So it just passes the source along. So you can either use bound source chain where you set the source directly and you pass it a game object, or where its source gets passed or gets set by a template binding. So hopefully that makes sense. There's one other thing, a couple of gotchas I want to warn you about as you use template bindings. So let's come back to this example here. Let's say that this text, I just want to show you how I built it. Oh, that's not a good example. Let me see. What is it? What other bindings do I have in here? Let's go to the. Well, the tricky thing is that. Okay, here's a good example. So on the template binding, whenever you're setting the source or the target, whether it's on a template binding or a binding, there's kind of a gotcha that you got to watch out for. So the string list is the source, right? Well, if I had just dragged the string list in, notice it's now referencing the game object of string list, but I want it to reference this specific mono behavior, and so that's a little bit of a pain point with using this. So the easy way to do it is you want to drag string list. You want to drag the mono behavior in. So you got to get 2 inspectors open. So I lock this one, so this won't change, and then I open another inspector. If you've never done that, you just You just go Add Tab, Inspector. So now I've got two inspectors open. This one's locked and it's not going to change. This one's not locked, so it'll move. So if I select string list, now this is the thing. This specific model behavior is what I want. I don't want that game object. I want this model behavior. So I put that in, and now it's the model behavior that I'm referencing. If you drag in, so you have to drag in the specific component into the slot. If you don't drag in the specific component, then it won't work. Because if I had just dragged in game object right here, you'll see game object, everything breaks because game object doesn't have a property called values. And so this doesn't work. So if I stop it and drag in the component instead, then it works. So there we go. Now it's fixed. One other gotcha to be aware of is that Unity, the editor capitalizes and does some formatting on all your property names. So notice this says capital values V, but in the binding it's lowercase values v. That's because the actual property name in string list is a monolist, and monolist has lowercase values as the actual property name. But then Unity capitalizes it for you. And so you need to reference the actual spelling of the capital name. If I change this to capital V, again, it won't work because there is no capital V values for the as a property name. So, but if I change it back to lowercase values, I guess I have to run it again. If I change this to lowercase values, then it works. So those are the main two gotchas. Make sure you're using the right casing. Don't let Unity fool you. Use the right casing on your property names and drag in the specific component you want using a second inspector window. So hopefully bindings make sense. They're a little complicated to wrap your mind around at first, but once you start using them, they're really powerful and they can eliminate a lot of code if you use bindings instead.